When I pressed the FaceTime button to call my son, Daniel, my heart was filled with excitement. I only wanted to ask him when the exact wedding date would be so I could prepare. The screen lit up and my son's face appeared, but it wasn't him who spoke first. Vanessa, my soon-to-be daughter-in-law, sat right beside him, looking straight into the camera. Her smile was faint, almost icy, and then she dropped the words that crushed me. We already got married yesterday. We only invited special people. I froze. Right there on that tiny screen, I saw Daniel lowering his gaze, unable to meet mine. Meanwhile, Vanessa leaned back casually on the beige sofa, the very one I had paid for, her smirk making me feel like a stranger in my own family. In that instant, every sacrifice I had made over the last 3 years flashed before my eyes, paying their $500 rent every month, buying every chair, every refrigerator, every little thing they owned. I had filled their kitchen when they had nothing to eat, eating beans and rice myself so they could have better meals. And now, when I thought I would sit proudly in the front row at my son's wedding, it all came down to one cruel truth. I was not special. I glanced at the pale pink dress still hanging in my closet. $200 carefully saved, now doomed to remain unworn, never to shine on my son's wedding day. I still remembered the thrill of picking it out, imagining myself smiling in the wedding photos. And then I saw the photos online, the ones I would never appear in. Vanessa in a white gown, the very one I had given her $800 to buy. Her parents beaming beside the couple, her siblings raising champagne glasses in celebration. And me? I was nothing more than a walking ATM. That night, I sat alone in my kitchen, the yellow light spilling over the dining table. The same table that had, for years, been covered with bills and transfer notes. I thought about all my sacrifices, every drop of sweat turned into dollars to sustain 2 grown adults. And what did I get in return? A cold FaceTime screen, a mocking smile, and 4 words carved deep into my heart: special people. I cried, but not just for being shut out of the most important day of my son's life. I cried for all the years I had foolishly believed I could buy love and respect. That night, as my tears slowly dried, something else ignited inside me, a fire that would change everything. After that FaceTime call, I sat frozen in my living room for hours. The screen of my phone had long gone dark, but Vanessa's cold smile was still seared into my memory, like a burn that would never heal. Those 4 words, special people, echoed in my head like a cruel sentence. Daniel didn't say a thing. He just lowered his eyes, letting his wife sever the last bond between mother and son. In those eyes, the ones I once believed would always hold love for me, I now saw only avoidance. My only child, the boy I had raised for 35 years, stood there silent and cruel. I walked to my bedroom and opened the closet. The pale pink dress I had carefully saved up to buy for the wedding still hung there, along with a brand new pair of shoes that had never touched the ground. I had imagined countless times wearing that dress, sitting proudly in the front row, smiling as Daniel slipped the ring onto Vanessa's finger. But now, it was nothing more than a foolish dream. That night, I couldn't sleep. I paced the house, every corner reminding me of the sacrifices I had made for them. The sofa in the living room, I paid for it. The dining table and chairs, I paid for them. The refrigerator, the washing machine, the flat-screen TV Vanessa loved to show off on social media, all of them had come out of my pocket. And in the sparkling wedding photos online, there wasn't a single trace of me. Around 3 a.m, I sat down at the kitchen table, switched on the yellow light, and took out pen and paper. This time, I wasn't writing a transfer list. I needed to see, in black and white, exactly how much I had thrown away on those 2 ungrateful people. The numbers poured out like knife cuts. Rent, $2,500 per month for 36 months, $90,000. Living expenses, food, utilities, small medications, about $1,000 per month. $36,000. Wedding and honeymoon, dress, rings, reception, the trip to Hawaii, $20,000. Medical and emergencies, every sudden bill, every late-night crisis, $10,000. Car and repairs, a used car I bought for them, plus multiple major fixes, $15,000. Furniture and appliances, sofa, dining set, bed, refrigerator, washing machine, TV, $12,000. Gifts and holidays, birthdays, Christmas, anniversaries, carefully prepared packages, $10,000. Credit card debt I paid off for them, $7,000. When I added it all up, my hand trembled. The final total stared back at me. $200,000. $200,000. Every bit of my savings, my late husband's inheritance, the money I was supposed to use for a peaceful retirement, swallowed by a black hole named Daniel and Vanessa. I sat there, tears streaming down my face. But this time, I wasn't only crying from sadness. I was crying out of rage. Rage at myself for letting them turn me into a walking wallet. Rage for believing love and respect could be bought with money. When the morning light filtered through the window, I looked at myself in the mirror. The same tired face, the same wrinkles of age. But in my eyes, for the first time in years, I saw a new spark. A spark of determination. That morning, I brewed a cup of coffee as usual. But I didn't stare at my phone, waiting for a text or a call from them. I took a slow sip, exhaled, and whispered to myself, "It's time to say no. It's time to take my life back." The next morning, while I was still sitting with my cup of coffee, my phone rang. On the screen flashed a familiar name, Vanessa. I stared at it. For the past 3 years, whenever her name appeared, I would rush to answer. Because I knew behind that call was always a plea, an emergency, and I would once again drop everything to help them. But today, I let it ring 3 times before I finally pressed accept. Her voice came through, trembling, nothing like the arrogance she had shown on FaceTime the night before. "Mrs. Renata, the rent is overdue. The landlord says if it's not paid this week, we'll be evicted. Maybe you forgot to transfer the money?" I stayed silent. The silence stretched so long I could hear my own heartbeat. I remembered all the times I had rushed to the bank in pouring rain just to make sure their payment wasn't late. All the times I canceled plans with friends, ignored my own doctor's appointments just because they needed me right away. And now, after cutting me out of my own son's wedding, they still had the audacity to call as if nothing had happened. I took a deep breath and replied, my voice calm, so calm it surprised even me. "Vanessa, didn't you just say only special people were invited to the wedding?" "Well, from now on, I'll only help special people." The line went silent. I could hear her breathing falter. Then her voice returned, shaky. "What do you mean?" "We've always been special to you. You once said I was like a second daughter." I gave a bitter smile, a kind of smile I hadn't worn in years. "Words are cheap, Vanessa. Actions tell the truth, and your actions told me exactly who I am to you." I hung up. For the first time in years, I was the one to end the call. All that day, I felt strangely light. I sat at the kitchen table, the place that for years had been buried under transfer notes, and this time, instead of adding more, I opened the notebook I had filled the night before. The number $200,000 stared back at me, and I thought, why did I let myself be drained like this? I remembered nights eating nothing but stale bread so they could dine at restaurants. I remembered last winter, wearing a coat over 15 years old because the money for a new one had gone to Daniel's car payments. I remembered lying curled up in bed with back pain, yet still dragging myself to transfer the rent, terrified they'd be in trouble. And in all those times, I had never once heard a sincere thank you. That afternoon, Daniel called. Seeing his name lit up the screen, my heart clenched. Part of me still longed to hear his voice, to believe he would apologize, explain, make it right. But another part whispered, "Don't be foolish again." I answered. His voice sounded uneasy. "Mom, Vanessa said, You won't help us anymore? She must have misunderstood. You'll still cover the rent, right? I need you. Those 2 words, need you, made me laugh bitterly. For years, he hadn't needed a mother. He'd only needed an ATM. Daniel, I said slowly, I've done everything for you. For 3 years, I've paid for every bill from your rent to your meals. Do you know how much that adds up to? The silence on the line told me he didn't, so I answered for him. $200,000, Daniel. $200,000 from my savings, from your father's inheritance. And do you know what I got in return? A FaceTime call telling me I wasn't special. His voice broke. Mom, I'm sorry. We just wanted a small wedding. Only Vanessa's family. Only Vanessa's family? I cut in. And who am I, Daniel? I gave birth to you. I raised you alone after your father died. And now I'm... What? An outsider? I heard his breathing quicken. Then his voice cracked. Mom, we can't pay the rent if you stop. The landlord will evict us. Just one last time, please. I closed my eyes, recalling every time I had already helped one last time. How many times had it been? 10? 20? I had lost count. No, Daniel, I said firmly. This is the first time, and the last time, I'm refusing. You're an adult. If you and your wife can't manage your own household, that is no longer my responsibility. A choked sob escaped him. Then silence. I ended the call. That night, I sat at the dining table and reopened the notebook. But this time, I didn't cry. I looked at the numbers and saw them clearly. Not proof of my love, but proof of the abuse I had endured. I took my pen, drew a line under the total, 200,000, and beneath it, I wrote 4 words, bold and final, a vow to myself. Enough. It ends, I knew, from that moment on, everything would change. Daniel and Vanessa wouldn't accept losing the lifeline they had depended on. They would be angry. They would try to persuade me, even threaten me. But this time, I was ready. Because for the first time in years, I had learned how to say no. I thought that after hanging up, I would have at least a few days of peace. But I was wrong. Just one afternoon later, there was a pounding at my front door. When I opened it, Daniel and Vanessa were standing there. Daniel's head was down, while Vanessa stood with her arms crossed, lips curled into a cold smirk. "We need to talk. Right now," she spat out like a command. I blocked the doorway. "No, I have nothing left to say." But Vanessa pushed past me and stepped right into my home, dragging Daniel behind her. My son said nothing, following his wife like a shadow. A wave of bitterness rose in me. The little boy who once clung to my hand on his way to school was now a man led around by his wife, his will crushed. Vanessa sat down on the sofa, patting the cushion as though it were her own property. Her voice cut sharp. "You can't just cut us off like this. The $200,000 you've already spent, that's responsibility, a commitment. You think you can walk away so easily?" I stared into her eyes. "Vanessa, that money was mine. It was my life's sweat and tears, not some legal contract. And from this day on, you won't get another cent." Her face flushed red, but her eyes glittered with contempt. "You don't understand. You're putting Daniel in an impossible position. Without you, we'll lose everything. And when that happens, everyone will see Daniel as a failure, and it will be your fault." That was when Daniel finally spoke, his voice trembling. "Mom, please. Vanessa's right. If we lose our home, I don't know what we'll do. I can't stand people laughing at us." I bit my lip. Deep down, I still loved my son. But love couldn't blind me to the truth. He had let this woman use both him and me. "Love doesn't mean enabling weakness, Daniel," I said, keeping my voice steady. "You need to learn to stand on your own. If you choose to live off your wife and treat me like a bank account, that's your choice. not mine. Vanessa let out a bitter laugh. Fine. If you want to cut us off, don't blame us for what happens. Daniel, let's go. A woman like her doesn't deserve to be part of our lives anymore. They stood. Daniel turned away, but before leaving, he glanced back. His eyes were wet, filled with fear and perhaps a trace of regret, but no courage. He simply followed his wife out, leaving me alone in my silent home. I thought it was over. But a few days later, I realized Vanessa wasn't done. That morning, my neighbor, Dorothy Hemmeter, called me. Renata, you won't believe this. Vanessa was out on the street telling people you're stingy, that you abandoned your son and daughter-in-law in their hardest time. She even said the $200,000 was something you promised to support them with for life. I was stunned. So Vanessa didn't just want money. She wanted to destroy my reputation. That afternoon, I went to the grocery store. The people who used to greet me warmly now looked at me with suspicion. I even overheard whispers behind my back. That's the woman who has money, but won't help her own son. My heart ached. All my life, I had taken pride in being a devoted mother, a good neighbor. And now, in just a few days, my honor had been dragged through the mud by the very ones I had nurtured. That night, I sat at my table and opened my journal. My hand shook as I wrote, but every word felt like blood spilled on the page. They want to ruin me, not just with money, but with shame. But they've forgotten. I am no longer the weak woman I once was. If they think they can use and trample me forever, this will be their final mistake. I closed the journal and drew a deep breath. This time, the fire inside me wasn't just anger. It had become resolve. I knew that to end this game, I couldn't just say no. I had to show the world the truth. A plan for retaliation began to form in my mind, and I swore. This time, I would be the one holding the final card. Rumors spread faster than I imagined. Within a week, everywhere I went, I could feel the stares. People who once greeted me warmly now kept their distance. Some said nothing, but their eyes were enough to weigh heavily on my heart. One morning at the market, I overheard the butcher whisper to another customer, "There she is." Her daughter-in-law said she has piles of money, but is too stingy. Won't even help her own son. I pretended not to hear, but inside, it felt like a knife twisting. Vanessa didn't just want my money. She wanted to shatter the reputation I had spent 71 years protecting. That night, I sat in my living room, staring at the notebook with the number $200,000 underlined in red. I realized that if I kept silent, Vanessa's one-sided story would harden into truth in everyone's eyes. And I decided I would speak. That Sunday, the local church held its weekly community gathering. I put on a plain sweater and walked to the hall, my hands trembling but my heart burning. Inside, the room was packed. I saw Vanessa and Daniel already there. Vanessa was all smiles, chatting with a few neighbors, no doubt spreading more lies. When the pastor finished the prayer, I rose to my feet. My voice shook at first, but with every word it grew steadier. Forgive me for interrupting, but I need to clear something up. The whole hall turned to look at me. I held up my notebook. For the past 3 years, I have poured every bit of my energy and money into supporting my son and his wife. Here is the record. Every payment written down, rent, car, medical bills, their wedding, even the $800 gown I bought for Vanessa. Add it all up, and the total is $200,000. That is not a lifetime sponsorship. That is sacrifice. Sacrifice I gave freely until I realized I was being used. The room fell silent. I could hear papers rustling as people near me craned their necks to see the notebook in my hands. Vanessa shot up, her face crimson. "She's lying! She's just trying to humiliate us. Those are just meaningless numbers." I locked eyes with her. "Really, Vanessa? Was the sofa you sit on in your home my imagination? The refrigerator you posed with on Facebook? Did I invent that too? Or the car I paid to fix 3 separate times? A murmur swept through the hall. People pointed, whispered. Their eyes shifted away from me and landed squarely on Vanessa. Daniel rose, trying to grab his wife's arm. "Vanessa, stop!" But she yanked it free and shouted, "This is all your fault!" If you were a real mother, you wouldn't abandon your son. You want us on the street, don't you? You want everyone to think Daniel is a failure, don't you? Anger surged in me. But this time, it wasn't weakness. I stepped forward, my voice clear and strong. Daniel is not a failure because of money. He fails because he let himself be controlled, because he forgot that self-respect can't be bought with his mother's dollars. I raised him, but I cannot live his life for him, and I will no longer feed your greed. The hall was silent. Eyes turned to Daniel. My son, head bowed, shoulders shaking. For the first time, Vanessa's confidence cracked. She stammered, then suddenly grabbed Daniel's hand and stormed out. The doors slammed behind them. I sat down, my heart pounding, yet a deep relief washing over me. For the first time in years, I hadn't hidden, hadn't suffered in silence. I had spoken the truth, in front of the community, in front of my son, and most importantly, in front of myself. Dorothy Hemmeter gently placed her hand on my shoulder and whispered, "Renata, you did the right thing. You've given too much for too long. Now it's time to take yourself back." Tears welled in my eyes, but I smiled. I knew this wasn't the end. Vanessa was not the kind to back down. But from this day forward, I was no longer the weak woman she thought she could manipulate. I had stood up publicly, and I had not fallen. I knew that after the public confrontation at the church, Vanessa wouldn't sit quietly, but I never imagined she would go this far. One morning, I received a thick envelope stamped from a law office. Inside were legal papers. Vanessa and Daniel had filed a lawsuit against me, accusing me of breach of financial support agreement and causing severe damages to their marriage. I sat frozen, the paper trembling in my hands. A financial support agreement? I had never signed any such thing. Every dollar I gave them was out of love, not obligation, and now it was twisted into a legal duty. The doorbell rang. It was my neighbor, Dorothy Hemmeter. She saw my pale face and immediately asked, "What's wrong, Renata?" I handed her the papers. Dorothy frowned, then muttered, "Dirty tricks." Vanessa must be behind this. But don't be afraid. The truth is still on your side. The court date arrived faster than I expected. The county courthouse was brightly lit, polished wooden benches filling the room. I sat at the defendant's table, clutching my notebook, the only proof I had. Across the aisle, Vanessa appeared in a black business dress, her face carefully painted, her eyes cold. Daniel sat beside her, his head down, avoiding my gaze. His hand trembled as he signed papers Vanessa pushed in front of him. Their lawyer stood and spoke firmly. "Your Honor, the defendant, Mrs. Renata, has repeatedly committed to providing long-term financial support for her son and daughter-in-law. The plaintiffs relied on these commitments to build their life, but she unilaterally cut them off, leaving them at risk of losing their home and stability. We request compensation." I listened, my blood boiling. Those words turned my love into a legal trap, my sacrifices into a crime. When it was my turn, I rose to speak. At first my voice shook, but then it grew stronger. "Your Honor, I never signed any agreement. This is my notebook, where I recorded every expense. Rent, groceries, the wedding dress, even their honeymoon. The total is $200,000. Every cent came from the love of a mother, not a contract. I gave because I believed love could be repaid. But in return, I was excluded from my own son's wedding, humiliated as not being special, and now treated as a criminal. If this is the justice they seek, then where is the justice for a mother like me?" The courtroom went silent. I glanced around and saw a few spectators whispering, shaking their heads. Vanessa suddenly jumped up, her voice shrill. "Don't listen to her! She just made up those numbers. Daniel, tell them! Tell them your mother promised to support us forever." Daniel lifted his eyes, lost and trembling. His lips moved, but no sound came out. The whole room waited. Vanessa shoved his shoulder, hissing, "Say it!" He looked at me. For a split second, I saw the little boy he once was, the child who clung to me in the dark, but then his head dropped and he stayed silent. The judge banged his gavel. "Order!" "Do the plaintiffs have any formal evidence beyond testimony?" Their lawyer stammered. We have text messages, phone calls." I cut in. "Yes," I texted, "I'll help you this time." But each "this time" turned into dozens. That was compassion, not a contract. The judge leaned back, thoughtful. Finally, he fixed his eyes on Vanessa. "Without binding proof, all support is considered voluntary." This court cannot force the defendant to continue. Vanessa's face drained of color. Her eyes flashed with fury. She turned on Daniel, snapping, "You're useless! All you had to do was say one sentence." But Daniel stayed quiet, his eyes wet. The hearing ended without a final ruling. But I knew I had already won half the battle. I had stood up. I had spoken the truth in front of the law. As I stepped out of the courtroom, Dorothy was waiting in the hallway. She gripped my hand. "Renata, you were magnificent. Vanessa may try again, but now the whole community has seen who the real exploiter is." I smiled through tears. Yes, the war wasn't over, but I had reclaimed something priceless, my own voice. And this time, I swore, no one would take it away again. I thought that after the court hearing, Vanessa would back down, but I had underestimated her greed. Just 1 week later, I received a call from an unknown number. When I answered, a woman's voice came through. "Hello, Mrs. Ellison. This is Lauren King, a social worker from the Office of Senior Services. We've received reports that you've been showing unusual financial behavior and isolating yourself. I need to visit you to conduct a wellness check." I froze. It was clear this was Vanessa's new trick, turning my love and clarity into evidence of illness. That day, I still let Mrs. King into my home. She sat down at the table and pulled out a file. Her voice was calm, but each word felt like a knife. "We've received reports that you cut off contact with your family, spent money irrationally, installed excessive security systems, and refused medical help. These are signs that could indicate cognitive decline." I clenched my fists, my heart pounding, but I stayed composed. "Mrs. King, I will not answer any questions without my lawyer present. Please wait." I called Mr. Weber. Less than 30 minutes later, he arrived. When he saw the file, his face hardened. "Mrs. King, unless you have a court order, approaching and questioning my client in her own home is harassment. Furthermore, we have complete financial records, medical reports, and psychological evaluations proving Mrs. Ellison is fully competent." Mrs. King hesitated. She reviewed the documents Mr. Weber handed her. Bank statements, medical checkups, and Dr. Moore's mental evaluation. After a few minutes, she sighed. "Indeed, the reports I received don't match reality. I'll close this case. I apologize for the inconvenience." When she left, I collapsed into my chair, cold sweat running down my back. I finally understood that Vanessa would stop at nothing, even painting me as a senile old woman in the eyes of the law, just to steal my money. That evening, Dorothy brought me a pot of hot soup. Sitting in my living room, she held my hand. "Renata, I know you're scared, but believe me, the community sees Vanessa's true face now. You're not alone anymore." Tears rolled down my cheeks, but not from weakness. They were because I realized I still had genuine people by my side. A few days later, Mr. Weber and I decided to strike back. We filed for a temporary restraining order against Daniel and Vanessa. Mr. Weber said firmly, We're not just defending anymore, Mrs. Ellison. It's time to prove in court that you are a victim of elder financial abuse, and that is a federal crime. When I heard the words federal crime, a fire ignited inside me. I was no longer prey being hunted. I would fight, not only for myself, but for every mother, every grandmother who had ever been belittled, exploited, and coerced by their own flesh and blood. I knew the greatest battle was still ahead, but this time, I was ready. The day of the official trial, I woke up at 5 a.m. I sat in front of the mirror for a long time, staring at the silver hair and the wrinkles carved deep on my face. But instead of exhaustion, what shone in my eyes was determination. I put on a simple black suit and pinned the small brooch my late husband once gave me. To me, today was not just another hearing. It was the battle that would decide the dignity of my final years. The courthouse was more crowded than I had imagined. Local journalists had shown up too. News of the old woman who cut off her son and daughter-in-law's financial support and got sued in return had spread fast. I stepped into the courtroom, feeling dozens of eyes on me. On the plaintiff's side, Vanessa appeared in a tailored black dress, her hair in a tight bun, her face carefully painted. She looked more like an actress about to step on stage than a woman seeking justice. Daniel sat next to her, head bowed, avoiding everyone's gaze. Their lawyer, Gregory Hale, stood and spoke firmly. Your Honor, we will show that Mrs. Martha Ellison has demonstrated alarming changes in her behavior. She abruptly cut off the financial support she had previously committed to providing. This has caused severe damages to my client's stability. We believe she is no longer capable of managing her affairs and requires legal guardianship. I clenched my fists under the table, but forced myself to stay calm. His words twisted me into an irresponsible woman, turning my generosity into a legal obligation. Then Vanessa rose to testify. Her eyes shimmered with tears, her voice trembling with carefully rehearsed sorrow. Mrs. Martha has always been like a second mother to me, but lately she's become irritable, uncommunicative, completely different. We are deeply worried about her mental health. We only want what's best for her. Her words sounded like honey, but I knew they were nothing more than venom coated in sugar. My lawyer, Mr. Weber, stood for cross-examination, his voice sharp. Mrs. Cole, can you tell the court the last time you called Mrs. Ellison without asking for money? Vanessa hesitated. I can't recall exactly, but we talked often. Did you invite Mrs. Ellison to your wedding? Weber cut her off. Vanessa flushed. It was a small ceremony, so small that your parents, siblings, and relatives all attended, yet Mrs. Ellison, who paid $800 for your dress and thousands more for your preparations, was excluded? The courtroom buzzed. Vanessa stammered, unable to give a clear answer. Next came Daniel's turn. My heart ached as I watched my son raise his hand and swear to tell the truth, only to let daggers fall from his lips. My mother has changed. She has become cold, irrational. We believe someone is manipulating her, turning her against her family. Weber stepped closer. Mr. Ellison, in the past 3 years, how much money has your mother spent on you and your wife? Daniel's head dropped. I don't know exactly. Was it about $200,000? Daniel stayed silent. Have you ever visited your mother without asking her for money or help? The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Daniel could not answer. Is it true that you and your wife entered her home without permission, bringing along a lawyer to pressure her into signing a power of attorney? Daniel stammered. We only wanted to help her manage. To manage or to seize control of her assets? Weber pressed. Daniel froze, his face pale. Finally, it was my turn. I rose, walked to the stand, and took a deep breath. Facing dozens of eyes, I told everything. Each payment, each loan, each humiliation I endured in silence because I believed one day my son would understand a mother's love. In 3 years, I spent $200,000 on Daniel and Vanessa. That is not an obligation, not a contract. That is love. And yet, what I received in return was exclusion, contempt, and now an attempt to legally strip me of my freedom. If a mother's love can be twisted into evidence of incompetence, then what meaning does justice have left? The courtroom fell silent. I saw tears glistening in the eyes of some spectators. As I stepped down from the stand, Vanessa avoided my gaze. Daniel sat slumped, his hands trembling. I knew this was only the surface of the war. But I also knew that for the first time in years, I had stood firm in the storm, as a woman of worth, no longer the walking ATM they had tried to make me. After weeks of waiting, Judge Harrison finally delivered the verdict. He looked directly at me and declared firmly, "Mrs. Martha Ellison is fully competent to manage her own finances and her life." The court rejects all requests for guardianship. Furthermore, evidence suggests this is a case of elder financial abuse. Mrs. Ellison has the right to file a civil lawsuit if she wishes. I closed my eyes, feeling a wave of heat surge through my chest. I had won, not just for myself, but for every mother and grandmother who had ever been belittled and exploited. That day, as I left the courthouse, Dorothy gripped my hand tightly. "Renata, you didn't just win your freedom. You proved that we, older women, still have the right to say no, still have the right to protect ourselves." I laughed through tears. Yes, I was no longer a victim. I had become living proof that real love cannot be bought, and that fake devotion will eventually show its true face. 3 months later, I sold the old house filled with painful memories and moved into a cozy apartment near the city center. I changed the locks, installed a modern security system, not to protect against criminals outside, but as a reminder to myself, I had learned how to protect my own life. I used part of my remaining money to travel through Europe, donated another portion to funds that protect the elderly from financial abuse. And the rest? I used it to live for myself, taking art classes, joining a book club, and sometimes simply buying a beautiful bouquet of flowers to brighten my living room. Daniel and Vanessa? I no longer heard from them. People said they had to move into a smaller apartment and that Vanessa finally got her first job. Perhaps adversity would teach them what my money never could, the value of honest work and independence. One evening, as I stood on my balcony beneath a sky full of stars, I thought back on the road I had traveled. The woman who once trembled while waiting for a message from her son no longer existed. In her place stood me, a 71-year-old woman who had learned that true love does not come with a price tag. Freedom is always worth fighting for. And the most important person I must love and protect is myself. I lifted my head and smiled. My life was finally back in my own hands, and this time I would never let it go again. What would you have done in my place? Would you have continued to sacrifice everything for those who only saw you as a wallet, or would you have found the strength to finally say enough? If this story touched you, don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Revenge Tales for more powerful stories of resilience, betrayal, and redemption. Because sometimes the most important battle we fight is the one to reclaim ourselves.